Greetings and thank you for joining us. In this series we will be painting, making a silicone mold for water effects, adding color resin water effects, and finally adding foliage to our Mirror Lake water tiles. Mirror Lake is Act 4 of our ongoing tabletop campaign. Act 4 takes place in the wetlands, and these pieces we are working on are specifically designed to hold a thick murky resin to enhance the tabletop adventure. These are the water tiles we will be painting, so let's get started and clean the pieces with fire. We're going to use a torch type lighter, but you can pretty much use any type of lighter. What we want to do is remove any stringing that the 3D printer nozzle may have left behind. Just breeze by the terrain and the string should quickly melt away. And remember not to hold the fire in one place too long. As you can imagine, PLA will melt and warp pretty quickly. We're going to use a variety of brushes, notably a big brush for dry brushing, which was like $1 from the local home improvement store. Let's get started by painting the rocks base gray on each of the tiles. What we want to do is add paint here and there so that our rocks have a range of black and gray spots. This is just the foundation layer of the rocks, and we'll come back and finalize the look of the rocks later. We generally use Percorny paints for terrain, however you can pretty much use whatever paints you have. And you may have noticed we don't primer our terrain, and that's because the paint adheres to the PLA just fine. And because of this, we almost always choose black PLA, which helps keep the cracks and the deep recesses nice and dark. Be sure to paint the rocks that will be underwater, like these. This will give your piece a sense of depth when it's filled with resin. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now let's grab earthstone paint and a big dry brush. This is really an easy step. What you're going to do is dry brush your entire tile, the wet side and the dry side. And when we say wet side, we're meaning the side that is going to be filled with resin, and the dry side, which is the grass and lightly over the rocks. After the earthstone color, let's grab deep water green. And with this color, we're going to do the same thing. Let's dry brush the rocks and the wet and dry sides of the piece. Also note you don't want to go too dark on the rocks, just, lightly go over them. The goal here is to have the earthstone color and the green color both blending and visible. We're not trying to cover up the previous color, we're just trying to add to the spectrum of color. Alright, that is looking good. Now let's grab the sludge color. We're going to wet brush this color on the wet side of the tile only. We want to stay about 1 inch away from the shoreline, and that's because we're going to use a different color on the shoreline. Now you don't have to be exactly precise. What we're going to do here is use the handle of the brush to kind of get an idea of what distance to stay consistent across all of our pieces. Alright, perfect. Let's break out the shallow water green, and now we're going to go ahead and dry brush the dry side of the piece, which is the grass and lightly over the rocks. We're also going to paint the wet side along the shoreline. That shallow water green is going to fill that 1 inch buffer that we made from the previous color. So it's going to go right up from the shoreline to the sludge. If the piece you're working on has rocks in the water, you want to push the shallow water green color into there as well. If the rocks that are in the water are close to the edge of the tile, try not to add shallow water green all the way up to the edge, because when you push a tile next to it, it's not going to match up. Okay, we're moving right along. Now let's grab moss green. So with this color, you're going to dry brush the edge, the dry side, where the grass is, and lightly go over the rocks. So let's do a couple more of these and get a good look at what we're going for. That's looking pretty good, right? It's a good idea to set the pieces next to one another. You can double check to make sure your paint style is staying consistent. Well, we made it back around to the rocks. Let's mix 50-50 of stone edge or an off-white color and gray. I'm going to use this long bristle brush and lay the brush across the rocks and kind of use the side of the brush to paint the rocks. I'm also going to poke at the rocks with the tip of the brush. We're not necessarily painting the rocks with brush strokes, more so what we're doing is tapping the rocks. Our hope is that this will give the rocks a natural range of gray. In nature, the rocks can be speckled gray like granite, even have some mustard color moss, and they can have other colors depending on the minerals or weathering. That is why we started off painting the rocks, and then we came back to them after all the other colors were applied to this piece. And as you can see, this turned out really nice. Oh, and don't forget to lightly tap on the rocks that are underwater as well. One of the things you also want to consider is adding a little bit more white to your mix and put this on the high spots of your rocks, and it'll give it a nice natural look. Okay, that looks pretty good, so let's do the same thing on the rest of the pieces. And now for the last stage. We're going to use a 50-50 mix of school bus and cardboard. Let's mix those two up. And this time, we're going to use a brush with good bristles so we can control the paint. Well, what you want to do is target paint the net moss. Just lightly glide your brush over the top of them. Also, don't load your brush up too much with paint or be in a hurry. And I'll show you what happens in a second when you have too much paint on your brush. Right there. So if this happens to you, what you're going to do is you're going to grab some water and you're going to hose down that spot where you have too much paint, and then you're going to take a paper towel and suck up the water and the paint. And just in case you didn't see how I fixed it, you get to see how I err again. Anyhow, I hope that brought a smile to your face. This has been part 1, and in part 2 we're going to make a silicone mold which will allow us to add colored resin water effects. However, we won't be adding the resin in part 2, we're just making the mold. Then in part 3, we're going to color our resin and pour the resin. Then we're going to add foliage to finalize the piece, which will look amazing. We have other movies we're working on. Aside from our product reviews and tutorials, we will be releasing more history and lore of Mystic Realm, Tomb of Creatures, which is a series about creatures we created for our world, and we are talking about creating theatrical stories. So if that's something you're interested in, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure to sign up for our website newsletter to be notified about limited time free product codes, new videos, file updates, and crowdfunding projects. We wish you good fortune in the adventures to come.